There comes a moment in the life of an empath when silence becomes louder than explanations, when exhaustion becomes heavier than love, and when disappearing feels safer than staying. Most people think empaths are soft, endlessly forgiving, endlessly patient, endlessly available. They believe empaths will always understand, always return, always give one more chance. But what people fail to understand is that empaths are not weak because they love deeply. They are dangerous when they finally stop caring. And the terrifying part is this: you usually never see it coming, because empaths do not explode the way angry people do. They fade, quietly, slowly, emotionally, spiritually. They start dying inside long before they physically walk away. And by the time they finally cut someone off, the relationship has already collapsed inside their heart months earlier. What shocks people most is not the empath leaving, it is how permanent the departure feels. No drama, no revenge, no long speeches, just distance, cold silence, emotional disappearance. And suddenly the person who once answered every message, cared about every feeling, sacrificed sleep to help others heal, is gone like they never existed. But that disappearance did not happen overnight. It was built through repeated emotional wounds nobody noticed. Every empath carries an invisible limit. The problem is they hide their pain so well that people mistake tolerance for infinite patience. They smile while breaking. Inside, they stay while emotionally bleeding. They keep understanding toxic behavior until understanding becomes self-destruction. An empath will forgive disrespect because they understand trauma. They will forgive neglect because they understand stress. They will forgive lies because they understand fear. But eventually they realize something painful: understanding someone's pain does not excuse being destroyed by it. And that realization changes them forever. Because the moment an empath understands they are abandoning themselves to save others, something inside them snaps. Not loudly, quietly, spiritually, psychologically. The emotional door begins closing. And once that door closes completely, even love cannot reopen it. People often accuse empaths of changing suddenly, but what looks sudden to others was actually emotional starvation over a very long time. Empaths spend years trying to communicate gently. They give warnings nobody hears because their warnings sound too calm. They say things like, "I feel hurt, I need space, I don't feel appreciated," but toxic people ignore these signals because empaths rarely scream. And this is why the final cutoff feels shocking, because people only pay attention when the empath disappears. Nobody notices the thousand silent disappointments that happen before the goodbye. Nobody notices how many nights the empath spent mentally exhausted trying to save a relationship alone. Nobody notices how often they swallowed their own feelings just to keep peace. Empaths are emotional shock absorbers. They absorb tension, guilt, pain, chaos, insecurity, manipulation, and emotional confusion from everyone around them. But eventually, even the strongest nervous system collapses under constant emotional pressure. And when an empath reaches emotional burnout, they stop negotiating. Something cold enters them, not hatred, clarity, dangerous clarity, the kind of clarity that finally says, "I cannot heal in the same place that keeps hurting me." That sentence changes everything. Because once empaths stop emotionally idealizing people, they start seeing reality without emotional filters. They see manipulation they once excused. They see disrespect they once minimized. They see one-sided relationships they once romanticized. And the hardest truth they discover is this: some people only love their access to the empath, not the empath themselves. That realization creates one of the most painful awakenings an empath can experience. Because empaths love with enormous emotional depth. They do not casually invest their heart. When they care, they truly care. They remember small details. They feel your moods. They try to protect your feelings even while neglecting their own. Their loyalty is intense. Their emotional attachment is real. So when they finally realize they are being emotionally drained instead of emotionally valued, the grief becomes unbearable. It feels like betrayal on a soul level, especially because empaths often attract narcissistic personalities, emotionally unavailable people, manipulators, and deeply wounded individuals who crave healing but resist accountability. Toxic people are drawn to empaths because empaths provide emotional oxygen. They listen endlessly. They nurture endlessly. They forgive endlessly. But eventually the empath realizes something tragic. Some people do not want healing. They want access. Access to comfort. Access to emotional labor. Access to unconditional understanding without responsibility. And when the empath recognizes this pattern, their entire emotional system changes. The nurturing energy begins turning inward. The emotional investment disappears. The rescue instinct dies. And this is when people panic. Because the empath who once chased connection suddenly becomes unreachable. One of the darkest truths about empaths is that they often stay too long because they believe love can heal dysfunction. They confuse emotional endurance with loyalty. They believe if they love harder, communicate better, sacrifice more, or become more patient, things will finally improve. But unhealthy people often interpret empathy as permission. The more forgiving the empath becomes, the more careless others become with their heart. And eventually the empath reaches psychological exhaustion. This exhaustion is different from ordinary stress. It is soul fatigue, the kind where even conversations feel heavy, where texting back feels emotionally draining, where hearing another apology feels empty because behavior never changes. And when empaths reach this stage, they no longer crave connection. They crave peace. Peace becomes more attractive than attachment. Solitude becomes safer than emotional chaos. And once peace becomes the priority, cutting people off becomes survival instead of cruelty. That is what many people misunderstand. Empaths do not suddenly become cold because they enjoy hurting others. They become distant because they finally understand what staying is costing them mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. There is also something psychologically fascinating about the empath's breaking point. Most people imagine emotional collapse as emotional chaos. But for empaths, the final stage often feels numb, empty, detached. The tears stop, the arguments stop, the explaining stops. Because they have already emotionally mourned the relationship internally before physically leaving it. By the time they cut someone off, they are no longer fighting for connection. They are recovering from emotional death. This is why their silence feels so final. They are not trying to manipulate anyone. They are trying to protect what little emotional energy remains. And people become confused because the empath who once tolerated everything suddenly tolerates nothing. Boundaries appear overnight. Access disappears overnight. Emotional availability disappears overnight. But again, it only looks overnight to people who ignored the slow destruction happening underneath. Empaths are like emotional volcanoes, quiet for years, then suddenly unreachable forever. Another reason empaths cut people off is because they eventually recognize patterns most others ignore. Empaths are highly emotionally intelligent. They notice energy shifts, inconsistencies, passive aggression, emotional manipulation, fake affection, guilt tactics, and hidden resentment long before others do. At first, they try to rationalize it. They try to remain compassionate. But repeated emotional contradictions slowly destroy trust. And once trust dies for an empath, reconnecting becomes extremely difficult, because empaths do not just listen to words. They feel intentions. They study emotional energy. They notice when apologies lack sincerity. They notice when affection becomes transactional. They notice when they are only contacted during convenience, loneliness, crisis, or emotional need. And eventually they ask themselves one painful question: who is there for me when I stop giving? That question exposes everything. Because many people love the empath's support but disappear when the empath needs support in return. This creates deep emotional loneliness inside empaths. A loneliness that exists even while surrounded by people. They become the emotional caretaker for everyone while silently starving themselves emotionally. And after years of this imbalance, they finally decide to disappear before they completely lose themselves. The most misunderstood part of an empath's cutoff is that it is rarely impulsive. It is usually the result of repeated emotional self-betrayal. Every time the empath ignored their intuition, minimized their pain, accepted disrespect, tolerated emotional inconsistency, or abandoned their own needs to maintain connection, they moved further away from themselves. And eventually the inner self rebels. The nervous system rebels. The soul rebels. A person can only betray themselves for so long before their entire psychology demands change. This is why many empaths go through dramatic transformation periods after cutting people off. They become quieter, more selective, harder to access emotionally. They stop over-explaining. They stop chasing. They stop trying to save everyone. Some people call this cold. But often it is the first time the empath has ever truly protected themselves. Healing changes an empath. Pain matures them. Betrayal sharpens their intuition. And once they learn the difference between being needed and being valued, they never love the same way again. What makes this transformation powerful is that empaths eventually realize boundaries are not cruelty. Boundaries are self-respect. Distance is not hatred. Distance is wisdom. Silence is not weakness. Silence is recovery. And perhaps the most important realization of all is this: not everyone deserves unlimited access to a sensitive heart. That realization liberates them psychologically. Because empaths spend much of their life feeling responsible for other people's emotions. They absorb guilt easily. They fear hurting others. They fear disappointing people. But eventually they understand something revolutionary: protecting your peace is not selfish. And once that understanding enters an empath's mind deeply enough, their entire life changes. They stop forcing connections that drain them. They stop rescuing people committed to dysfunction. They stop negotiating with emotional chaos. Suddenly, the empath who once looked emotionally fragile becomes emotionally untouchable. Many people spend years underestimating empaths because kindness looks soft from the outside. But kindness backed by self-respect becomes unstoppable. When an empath finally learns to walk away from emotional harm without guilt, they become one of the strongest personalities imaginable. Because now their compassion is guided by wisdom instead of self-sacrifice. They still love deeply, but they no longer abandon themselves while loving others. They still care, but they recognize when care becomes exploitation. They still help people, but they stop helping people destroy them emotionally. And this evolution terrifies manipulative individuals because they lose emotional control. The empath stops reacting emotionally to guilt tactics, stops responding to manipulation, stops reopening doors that nearly destroyed their mental health. And this is why some people become angry when empaths leave. Because they love the empath deeply, but because they lost access to someone who tolerated too much. The truth is, empaths do not enjoy cutting people off. It breaks them internally. Even after leaving toxic situations, many empaths still grieve the memories, the potential, the emotional investment, and the version of the relationship they hoped existed. They replay conversations endlessly. They question themselves. They wonder if they were too harsh, too distant, too emotional, too sensitive. But eventually healing reveals the truth. Staying in environments that continuously wound your spirit is not love. It is self-erasure. And once an empath understands that, returning becomes impossible. Because they finally realize their sensitivity was never the weakness. Their refusal to protect it was. So if an empath suddenly cuts someone off, understand this carefully. The silence you see now was built from pain you never saw before. The distance was created through emotional exhaustion, repeated disappointment, broken trust, and internal battles hidden behind calm smiles. The empath did not wake up one day and stop caring. They cared too long, too deeply, too selflessly, until caring started destroying them from within. And eventually survival became more important than attachment. Peace became more important than history. Self-respect became more important than emotional dependency. That is when the empath disappears. Not to punish others, but to finally save themselves. And once they discover the peace that comes from no longer betraying their own soul, they rarely return to the chaos they escaped from.